Ladies of the jury. Robert and Tayton Baker, two young boys with such a long life ahead of them to live. And the evidence in this case has shown no proof that there was any reason to justifiably kill or commit excusable homicide on these two boys. No reason to justify or excuse brutally beating them to death with a hammer and slitting their throats with a knife. None. They did nothing on the morning of August 26, 2020 to provoke this defendant to enter the house and kill them. He didn't get provoked by finding them with his wife. He didn't get provoked by finding them abusing his child. None of that. There's no evidence that any of that was even happening. What was going on? They were sleeping in their home that morning. The evidence at the scene supports that. They were found laying where they always went to sleep in those initial days in that home next to where their cell phones could charge. And we know they were sleeping because this man, the defendant, told detectives, I went in there. They were sleeping. They did nothing, ladies and gentlemen. And the judge just went through a lot of law with you guys, obviously. And so there's an instruction in all of that he read to you that tells you that when you consider each count, you're to start at the top and you're to analyze the evidence for the highest charge alleged and then go through the lesser included. So I'm going to spend my time this morning because the state believes, or this afternoon, the state believes that the evidence is overwhelmingly in support as charged. And so I'm going to focus on that with you. And you know, we talked in jury selection and you learned that there's more than one way to commit first-degree murder, and you've now heard those instructions. And the state's obviously going under both theories in this case, okay? And so first we'll talk about premeditation and what that means, where that evidence comes from in this case, and then we'll talk about the felony murder, okay? And you heard the three elements. I don't expect those first two elements to be in dispute in this case, either to count one or count two, okay? So we're gonna focus now and talk about why there was a premeditated killing of both Robert and Tayton Baker under the law. And again, I know the judge read this sort of at the beginning, but just remember, and you remember whether I selected you last week during the jury or Mr. Lewis, but both of us gave examples of premeditation. And you remember when we went through with you and we talked about the fact that even just somebody quickly, within seconds, going and obtaining a weapon and committing a crime that was done and over and thought of in seconds could be premeditation, okay? And you guys had that definition. Well, we have far beyond that in this case, and I want to talk about that with you. Much like most crimes, the premeditation in this case begins obviously with thoughts. It's very clear now that the trial and evidence has ended that this defendant thought about killing these boys. Now, why? You've now heard several things, and we're going to go over that. But clearly, he had thoughts of killing them for whatever reason, right? He gave many reasons. I was protecting my family is the overall reason, but thoughts of killing them, whether it's because he thought his family was going to be turned in, whether he thought they were doing something to his kid, his wife, whatever it is, it began with thoughts. And we have that in this case. We know while he was thinking about it, and he had these thoughts, and he's struggling with thoughts, what did he do in the early morning hours of August 26th? He wrote a letter to Cindy. And I want to point out a few things from that letter. You get a little bit of whatever feelings he was going through in the early morning hours. He's frustrated. He's upset. And he says to her, and this last line, one of the last lines is important if you look at the tense. Please promise me that she will always know that her dada is a soldier, talking about his daughter, and that he loved you both from day one. Why would he need to write Cindy that letter if he wasn't going to be around and if he wasn't going to be able to tell his little girl himself how much he loved her. There's been no evidence that they were fighting and breaking up. And no, he told the detectives in the interview they were just about to go get their water and power turned back on and move back in together. How much he loved his family. Now that's the reason and the excuse that it took him a minute to come up with in the interview room as to what he meant by that letter. But that letter was written the night or the early mornings before this happened. Why? Why do you say that? Unless you need someone else to ensure that your daughter knows that you loved her because you're not going to be around. So he's putting his thoughts in writing. And then, of course, we know in this case, once the decision has been made to do it, now we've had time to reflect already. We've thought about it. We've written a letter contemplating not being around. Now we're going to arm ourselves with 2 weapons. And the 2-weapon thing is important for a couple reasons. But I want to touch on the other thing, and you may have picked up that the state pointed out a few times that in the game room outbuilding, there was a Glock, a gun box. It was pretty obvious. It sat on the corner of a desk and ammunition on top of that, okay? And we pointed that out, and you heard the testimony from Sarah Baker that the night before this, they were in that game room putting the shelves up and all of Chad's figurines, and they were trying to surprise him when he came back home. So we know Mark Wilson was in that room. We know that he likely saw that gun, and that's an option. Why didn't he take the gun? The gun still would have made it premeditated murder, but I think it's important to note what he chose. He chose 2 weapons. He chose weapons that would not necessarily make it a quick murder. A gun would have been a quicker way to kill those boys. He chose a hammer to beat them with, a knife to slit their throats if he needed to. He found 2 items. That takes time. He then entered, and while killing each of the boys, which we'll talk about, he switches weapons. He beats each of them and then switches to slitting their throats. Every step of the way, there's opportunities to stop and reflect, realize what you're doing, and not continue. And so, of course, we know those are the weapons. And so after he arms himself, he obviously walks. He walks from wherever he is on the property, his house, the other outbuilding, and enters that house. It's steps. It's not a mile. But again, there's nothing in the law that tells you that someone has to think about it for 10 minutes, walk a mile to change their mind. He has time to change his mind. He enters the house after walking from somewhere else on the property. Now I want to talk about the circumstances of the actual killing. All of this has already occurred. And then he makes the decision to enter the home, right? And when you talk about the crimes of each boy, I want to start with Robert. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit later in more detail. Even though the defendant states in his statement that he killed Tayton first, I'm going to talk to you later about why I believe that's not consistent with some of the evidence. And we may touch on it here as well. Robert, remember his injuries. He has a large neck injury and 5 other stabbing injuries. And these photos are awful, but I think you now understand why the state has to show you these things, has to show you details, because remember what Dr. Fulcher said. That's not one slice to the neck. All of those little slices down there below show multiple, bringing out of a blade and making the choice to do it again. And then obviously you have all of the superficial wounds in addition to that. Robert has at least 4 blunt force injuries. He had a blunt force on his chin. He had 2 over his left ear, which caused that photograph that you saw with the back of his skull cracked open. And he has the blunt force on the forehead and to the top of the head, which you saw that perfectly punched out circle, skull fracture, brain damage by the one near the ear. That takes a lot of force. Every time you beat someone with a hammer and you slice someone with a knife, that's time. That's time. And then what does he do? He covers Robert up. He covers Robert up. And then, of course, we have Tayton. Tayton has similar injuries, although a lot more, and a lot more going on with Tayton that you saw in the pictures and the scene. He has approximately 15 to 20. I'm just going to approximate. You guys rely on your notes from that. But we obviously have the 3 very large injuries. But remember what Dr. Fulcher said, every single small superficial injury on that case shows an attempt to keep slicing his neck. And then what else with Tayton? We have at least, well, let's count them. Let's count the blunt force injuries. We have the one under his lip. What did Dr. Fulcher tell you? And he explained why that's not something that he got hit in the face. He didn't get hit in the face. Why? Because you would clearly see an injury out here, and there was no injury. You saw the face photo of him in the beginning of the autopsy, and you don't see the injury there. So that is him laying down on the ground, being beat in the back of his head, causing so much force that laying on the carpet causes that injury. And then, of course, you have, kind of starting on the left side of his head, you have 1, 2, and 3 blunt force, 4 and 5, 6 and 7, right there. Every blow takes time. And there's a chance to stop and reflect. And obviously, between the 2 boys, you have 2 different victims in 2 different locations, still feet away. But it's time, oh my God, what did I do? And not go on and kill the other. Because that's not what happened here. And with Tayton, to further illustrate the struggle, the time that this crime would have taken, and the fact that he was faced with fighting or a confrontation with Tayton, instead of just killing somebody in their sleep, and they have no time to react and maybe cause somebody to stop. What do we have with Tayton? We have defensive wounds, and we have him crawling away, ladies and gentlemen. All of these things, you play it out, how this could have possibly happened, and it shows how much time this crime occurred. That takes time. That blood trail takes time. And we know, because he's also covered up with a blanket, we know his bloody palm print is on the wall, inches from his phone, a foot or so away from where he eventually lay. We know that palm print had to have gotten there while Mark Wilson was still there, struggling with him and fighting with him, because how does Sarah find her son Tayton? Right, covered with a blanket, right where he lay when FDLE got there to photograph him. So that struggle that he didn't remember, that he didn't want to talk about, do you remember that from the interview? It was towards the very end when Detective Usina asked him about Robert. He was able to just kind of answer the questions. Yes, head, neck, that's how I did it. But when he asked about Tayton, I don't know. What about him crawling? I don't know. He didn't want to talk about it because it's horrific. He didn't want to talk about that. You don't forget that. And all of that shows the lengthy premeditation and all of his opportunities to stop. And again, he covers them with a blanket, like I said. And ladies and gentlemen, that summarizes everything that proves premeditation in this case beyond the exclusion to every reasonable doubt for both boys, for counts 1 and 2 under that theory. But we also have submitted to you that he's guilty under the felony murder theory as well. Okay, and I know, again, you just heard it from the judge, but essentially it means that both boys are dead. I'm kind of going to talk about them together. Both boys are dead, that he was a person that killed them, which we know that. The defense, and I expect it to continue, has essentially conceded that he's the one that did this. This is not a who done it. So element 2, that the defendant killed the boys while engaged in the commission or an attempted commission of a burglary. Okay? The judge has explained it to you. And there's only 2 elements to burglary. And if you remember again in jury selection, when Mr. Lewis and/or I talked to you about burglary, and you probably walked in last week like thinking of the typical burglary. Somebody breaks into your house, steals your TV, or you're there, unfortunately, when that happens. But I think it was a surprise to a lot of people when we said, well, there's this other way. You can get invited in and be a guest, and then if you commit a forcible felony or violence against the homeowner who gave you permission, that turns that into a burglary, because you would not want that to happen, and you would be revoking your consent right there. And everybody's like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it makes sense why the legislature would do that. So that is the other theory we have here. And we know that he had permission to be on that property, that Sarah and Chad Baker were helping him and Cindy out. He had permission to be living in the outbuilding and coming and going while he was in that house. And when he was on the property, clearly when he thought about doing this, and he formed the intent to kill those boys and did all the things we just discussed and went in to do it. So felony murder in addition to premeditated murder. Now, something else we talked about in jury selection, is the why. And we don't have to prove the why, like you guys learned, and you've now been instructed by the judge, but obviously the why, the reasons why somebody may do that, they do play an important role, especially in this case, in thinking about his premeditation, because you want to know, what was he thinking, right? What did he say? How long had he been thinking about it? And things like that. So I want to go through with you, what do we know about all of the reasons why this may have been done. And first, I want to start with the first indication of why. And that was when his mom, Cindy Atkins, did the right thing. Her son came and told her, or she kind of confronted him about cooperating, and he told her he did it and why. And so she agreed to help law enforcement with that. And so I want to play for you just one clip from that car ride.
Like I said. She was supposed to do the first half, which meant her sister and the little boy, and he was supposed to do the other 2 boys. What the fuck?
And then later in the conversation, it's interesting because he tells his mom that. I think it's important. He tells his mom that when he doesn't know he's being recorded. And she asks him, are you doing this because of Cindy and Caitlin, which is, of course, all the reasons why he tells law enforcement, and he says no.
I know you felt unsafe because of Andy. But you're saying this because of Cindy and Caitlin and why you hurt these 2 boys. No. I don't understand that.
Right, his mom doesn't even, there's no reason, I don't believe a reason that would ever make sense in this case. But his mom doesn't understand this. Law enforcement clearly didn't understand, and they were giving him reasons and asking him why. And I want to go through just some of those to show you all of the different things he threw out. One of the things he said in the very beginning, and you might have missed it because he never brings it up again, but the very first reason he gives law enforcement, when they asked, is she alienating you? He's like, yeah, from my mom and my uncle. I mean, that he threw that out in the very beginning. It's never mentioned again. And then later, I believe that they're abusing my daughter, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. I believe Cindy is sleeping with the boys. I'm protecting my family, which was sort of the overarching theme of his entire interview with law enforcement. Another reason he threw out at one point, if you missed it, was, you know, they're just imploring with him, help us make this make sense. And he just says, you know, Caitlin got a busted lip. And I think Detective Sheena was like, did the boys do it? Like, what, you know, he's trying to understand. And he's like, no, but it happened here on the property. He's not sure how it happened, but that's apparently a reason. And Cindy was, of course, just amping him up. Cindy was just amping him up, but ultimately he tells law enforcement, but Cindy didn't directly tell me to do it. I just thought I was supposed to do it. None of it makes sense, ladies and gentlemen. None of it makes sense. And in this interview, when you kind of think about the statements he makes to his mom when doesn't know he's being recorded versus statements he makes to law enforcement after hours and hours and hours, I just want you to think about that. And think about whether he told the truth or not in this interview. And of course, we know he starts it off denying for several hours, right? He denies for several hours. He's shown that letter that he wrote. And if you were paying attention to his response when they showed him that letter, it wasn't like, oh yeah, I wrote this morning, an immediate, I know what this is. I was going to the store to buy eggs and I left this for my girlfriend. He read the letter. He read the whole letter. And they're asking him, why'd you write this? Why'd you write this? He stalled, and then eventually again came up with the excuse that he thought him and Cindy were breaking up. Even in the interview after confronted with the audio evidence between him and his mom, what does he still say right after? I didn't do it. I mean, he's just lying and lying and lying and lying. He's not credible. And then the daughter. His daughter was being sexually abused by the boys. He throws, and if you were watching the interview, and I followed up with Detective Usina is throwing out. Remember he told you, like, I do this, I try to see if there are reasons. He wasn't exactly talking a lot to him, right, Mark Wilson? So he's throwing out different things. Could it be this? Could it be this? And he agrees with him when he gets to that part. But what did Detective Usina tell you? Obviously, after that interview, they wanted to look into that and investigate that further. They sent Caitlin for a child protective team forensic medical examination. There's no evidence that that child was sexually molested. And then again, he tries to blame Cindy for all or part of it during his interview with little to no details. You know, and then at one point it's Cindy just helped clean up. Cindy knew, she didn't tell me, she made me think to do it, but she cleaned up. And so they're asking him, what did she do? What did she do to help clean up? Because you're saying you don't know how these weapons got back there. And one of the things that he says that Cindy did to help him was that Cindy creates this doctor's appointment and the idea to go to it as an alibi. That's how he's trying to essentially throw her under the bus in this interview, right? Well, what do we know? That's not true. Sarah Baker testified that the night before, she was asked to give them gas money to go to this doctor's appointment. She knew Cindy was pregnant. She knew she had to go get WIC benefits. She left $10 on the table. The $10 found under the body of Tayton Baker with blood on it, hence why they didn't have their $10 when they left and they had to go and see Debbie. That was a planned doctor's appointment. He's throwing Cindy under the bus in this interview. Also, Debbie testified. She knew about that meeting. That was no surprise when they called and asked for gas money, or the doctor's appointment. That was something the family knew was happening the next morning. That wasn't something that Cindy created that morning to cover for him. And then he mentions in the interview drugs and being up. Again, I want to just point out to that effect, there's no evidence of real impairment. There's no evidence of extreme impairment in this case. Think about a lot of that first part of the interview of the hours and hours of him lying and detectives trying to get all the details out for follow-up. How much driving did Mark Wilson do that morning? He drove a lot. He drove to the store. He drove them out to the appointment. He drove to their old house to check on his dog. He drove to the scene. And then when he got to the scene, Detective Higginbotham told you, and you heard him with your own ears in that interview. Did he sound upset? Sure, he didn't sound impaired, and Detective Higginbotham was like, I didn't notice anything that would have caused me any alarm, okay? And we have no evidence of impairment, extreme impairment in this case at all, to blame any of this on. So I point all this out for you to judge his credibility of how honest or not was he being in that interview when he gave you reasons. Now I want to talk to you about the DNA evidence, and it's obviously a lot of evidence and details we have to go through. So I've tried to summarize it here for you. And I mentioned earlier that the state believes the evidence supports Robert being killed first. There's a couple reasons for that. And one of the biggest reasons is DNA. Because what you're going to see as we go through this, whose DNA is overwhelmingly on everything? Dayton's. Robert is there, of course, on a few things. And sometimes when he's there, he's at a lot less DNA present than Dayton. But Dayton is on everything. And who is on the paper towels? Who is on the cleanup of the instruments? All of this. It's all Dayton. All of it is Dayton. And nobody else. Which would make sense if the last person you killed with the most bloody and violent scene was Dayton Baker, okay? So I want to talk about that. And just to summarize each piece of evidence for you. Again, the hammer, Dayton, okay? And I've put up here mostly references to the defendant, because you guys heard about all the other people. And when I say defendant not excluded, that is where they just don't have enough information. I'm not saying he's on there. What I'm saying is there's just not enough evidence. He's not excluded, okay? Knife, 1.2, Dayton on the blade, Dayton and Robert on the handle. On the sheath, Dayton +1. And so when I say +1, that's somebody who wasn't identified. Do you remember when she talked about mixtures, she would say there's a mixture of 2, like with the hammer. There's a mixture of 2 on all of those. She's able to identify Dayton, not enough to say about anybody else, okay? So when I just say Dayton on stain A, that was a sole complete profile by Dayton. Stain B, Dayton and Robert. Stain C, Dayton and 1, defendant is not excluded. And then what is most important about the knife, again, Dayton and Mark Wilson on the handler portion of the knife. And I had her show you guys where she took those swabs from the top edges and bottom edge of the knife and the sheath that she pointed out to you. And then the placemats. A mixture on stain A of 2 people, Dayton and the defendant. The handler, which is the area trying to avoid the stains, Dayton, Robert. It's a mixture of 4, Dayton, Robert, 1 unknown, and Mark Wilson. And placemat 1.4, that second placemat, you've got Dayton and Mark Wilson, and then you have all of them on stain B, Dayton, Robert, and Mark, and of course, Cindy is present on that one as well, on the back. And then, as I said earlier, the paper towels, they're all Dayton except for the handler. And so when it meant the paper towels, she described how she had just, again, avoided the red-brown staining to try to see if there was any other touch DNA. And then the sweatshirt. The sweatshirt was located, if you remember the testimony, in that first bathroom down the hallway. The bathroom that a detective came in and told you that when he rounded that corner in the house, clearing it, it smelled like fresh shower. It hit him, right? Mark Wilson obviously had to have a lot of blood on him from this scene. That's common sense. So this sweatshirt, which he was seen on video at the convenience store wearing that morning, Detective Usina asked him, it's the only thing they found. The shoes are missing still. The shorts were never found. He obviously had time to get rid of those things and came to the scene barefoot. Barefoot, if you remember that detail. This sweatshirt that he was in that morning was found in that bathroom where there's evidence of a fresh shower. And what was in it? What was in the pocket, according to Kelly Coco? Do you remember? Robert's phone. Robert's phone. And you saw in the crime scene photos, and Erin Morris testified that she showed you the phone cord and that there was no phone attached. So clearly, the killer sweatshirt with the phone. And so stain A, it's Mark Wilson. And then obviously you have Tayton and Robert on the front. And Robert on the back of that sweatshirt. These verdicts forms, again, that the judge went over with you, they are a little confusing, so I just wanted to again point out what the judge was talking to you about and what we believe the evidence in this case supports. As we just went over, the state believes the evidence in this case, beyond and to the exclusion of a reasonable doubt, supports first-degree premeditated murder and felony murder as to both count 1 and count 2. And that's where you would check on there. If my clicker would work. And then on count 3, this one has a few more questions. Guilty as charged of burglary, we've discussed that. And then you answer the question whether the structure entered was a dwelling. That's defined for you. I think that's pretty straightforward. And then the second one is just during the commission of the burglary, did he commit an assault or a battery on Tayton or Robert, which are lessers of murder, and that answer is clearly yes. And then in count 4, it's a slightly different version of burglary. You have the burglary and the dwelling, and then this time the different question is just, did the defendant, you also find beyond a reasonable doubt that during the commission of the offense, he had a weapon with him, which clearly in this case he had 2. Ladies and gentlemen, home is where you feel safe. Home is where your kids are supposed to be safe. And this is why, when we talked about burglary, this is why not just breaking into someone's house and stealing a TV is burglary. This is why when you invite a guest into your home and they start committing violence against you, that invitation is revoked and you are now committing a burglary. And again, like I said, we talked about this in jury selection, and this is exactly what happened to these 2 little boys. They were killed in their homes where they were supposed to be safe by this man. They were beaten to death. Their throats were slashed. Each one of those injuries would have been fatal alone. There was no need to pick up a second weapon. He may not have known that, but we would have still been here. But he did, because he wanted to make sure they died. He wanted to make sure they died. And then, what did he do? He covered each one of them up with a blanket. He covered each one of them up with a blanket so their mother could come out and discover them brutally murdered in her home, a horror she will have to live with forever. Why did he do that? He did that, if you believe what he told his mother, he did that to protect his family. He wanted them to pay. He wanted them to hurt. The people that were trying to help him, who had bought him a vehicle, who knew that he and Cindy had a drug problem, who were just trying to help, but at the same time had rules, and you're not going to live in a house without water and power, and you're not going to smoke marijuana around that baby, and you're going to come live with me, and guess what? If you don't clean up your act, I might call DCF. That threatened him, that scared him, and it makes no sense to any of us, but he killed those boys to upset that family and somehow get revenge. Ladies and gentlemen, he is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt as charged. There is no doubt And we ask you to return those verdicts in this case. Thank you.